Yeah. Okay, today we're going to begin and spend some time on doing review questions. Um, this is all recorded, so the sort of uh, basic concepts of the review questions, which are the questions which appear, some of which appear on the final exam, are available to you through YouTube. So we're picking up I think, at question 7, which deals with the relationship between Erasmus and Luther. Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. Now, the reason I use this term or this phrase is that this is actually what was said at the time of the Reformation. In particular, Catholics, looking at Erasmus, said, "Well, you're responsible for Luther. Uh, you laid the egg that Luther hatched." And what they meant by that was, and here's really the gist of it, Erasmus had, um, his whole program was based on reviving this original Christianity lying in the New Testament. And furthermore, he had, in terms of his what he found in the New Testament was this very what he called the philosophy of Christ, and what he meant by that was the Sermon on the Mount, simple, simplified religious ideas. Love thy neighbor as you would love thyself. A basic morality of being good to others, which would please God. This is the essential charity, was the essential virtue of a Christian. This is what Erasmus said, and he then proceeded to sort of critique the corruption, the materialism, the superstitious practices of the Catholic Church. And furthermore, using the printed book, he wrote all kinds of pamphlets critical of the church in the terms that I've described. So when you take it all together, there seems to be a certain truth. He prepared the ground for Martin Luther, this accusation. However, as a matter of fact, when Luther came on the scene, after a few months and a couple of years, Erasmus came out against Luther, and he tried to disown any kind of relationship between himself and Luther. And we could say that Erasmus took his distance from Luther. And there were clearly basic differences between the two guys, the two men. Erasmus was not a revolutionary, whereas Luther was. In the name of the gospel, Luther was prepared to go so far as to break with the Roman Catholic Church, which Erasmus, although he had all these criticisms and so on, Erasmus didn't believe in revolution. He thought, when he was doing his work prior to Luther coming on the scene, that change could take place on the basis of reform, not revolution, and that the Pope, the authorities in the church, would themselves undertake to address the corruption and so on. This is what he wanted, and he believed as much in the church as he did in the Bible, and he thought it was a horrible event that Luther was creating a schism in the church. He was breaking the unity of the Roman Catholic faith. So you can see this is reform, it's not revolution. This is the contrast between the two. Now, that's basically the thing you want to emphasize. But I think you should also point out that Luther's revolution was based on his insistence that the gospel, the Bible alone, the gospel was the only source of authority. This was the original document of the Christian religion, and that should be the test. And secondly, I'm enunciating his principles. The second point is that in the Bible, what we find is the doctrine of faith and faith alone saves. That's the second point. The gospel is the sole source of authority. Secondly, that faith and faith alone saves. Works, because human beings are fundamentally evil, their works, even their good works, compare that to Erasmus, even their good works, even their works of charity are of no avail. You have to depend on the grace of God, and you have to believe in the crucifixion. That is what saves you. That is the essential Christian act. It's not charity. It's not the sacraments of the church. It's justification by faith alone. And the last point is, when it comes to the church, Luther's attitude is that if you have faith and if you depend on the gospel, you are a priest. All Christians who accept justification by faith alone as described in the Bible are in effect priests. And there is no special category of priests who are intermediaries between God and man. So this is the essential contrast. And that should be the focal point of your answer. And then maybe add to that some discussion of the fact that the church was materialistic and corrupt, which even good Catholics acknowledged, and of course the Counter-Reformation addressed. And that secondly, beyond that, you want to say that all of this comes out of the humanist movement. In back of the Reformation was humanism, because it was all about recovering the original works of the classics of the pagan period of the before the Middle Ages, and this emphasis on Bible studies originated in the humanist study of the classics of the Romans and the Greeks. Both Erasmus and Luther were humanists in a sense, in that their education, their formation was based on the study of the classical writers. So that's basically the answer to that question. The next question is the challenge of the question is it's 8. The challenge of the Reformation was met by the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So it wants you to discuss first the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation. So briefly, in terms of the Reformation, the first guy, Martin Luther, the Bible alone, justification by faith, priesthood of all believers. Calvin, the Christian institutes which organize the Protestant teaching. Secondly, the Presbyterian Church, the strong, more or less grassroots church organization. Thirdly, the invention of Puritanism, the so-called Protestant ethic, the work ethic, which associates the development of this kind of radical Protestantism with the development of capitalism. And the last point is Calvinism is a religion of the middle class. It is a religion of the emerging capitalist class in European society, pointing to England, pointing to the Netherlands, pointing to Scotland, pointing to Switzerland. That's where the capitalism is strong, and that's where Calvinism is strong. So that deals with that. Now you want to deal with the Counter-Reformation. So the Counter-Reformation begins even earlier than Luther's appearance, because the conquest of Latin America adds millions of additional Catholics. The Catholic Church takes over Latin America, and with it, the indigenous are converted to Catholicism. Secondly, the popes have already begun, in a certain way, in a material sense, to lay the foundations of the Counter-Reformation, because they have consolidated their control over the papal state. They are rebuilding Rome in Renaissance terms, making it into a city of grandeur. And they are inventing a new form of art, the Baroque art. This new dramatic form of art is basically created by the Roman Catholic Church. So there is a material foundation. Latin America, the reconstruction of the papacy, and then the holding of the Council of Trent, 1545 to 63. The Pope is reaffirmed as the head of the Church, and the basic teachings of the Catholic Church, including the seven sacraments, the holding of pilgrimages, the worship of Mary, the worship of the saints, all of that is reaffirmed and clearly separates Catholicism from this newfangled Protestantism. Then, in addition to this, are the new religious orders, Theatines, Barnabites, and so on, especially the Jesuits. And these people, they preach and missionize both in Europe. They go into the Protestant areas and try to win people back. People who have been neglected are now, whose religious training has been neglected, are now given attention. Backing this up is the systematic practice of charity on the part of the Catholic Church. And of course, the overseas missions. The Jesuits, the Franciscans, they're active converting the indigenous in Latin America, but also they are active in Asia. And finally, the Index and the Inquisition, the Index of Prohibited Books, and so on. And last but not least, just as I said that Protestantism is associated, especially the Calvinist version is associated with the Calvinist Church, with capitalism, I would say that you see that the Counter-Reformation in Europe is especially strong, where the landowning class and the strong territorial kings are powerful. In Southern and Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, in Austria, in Italy, as Italy sort of loses its economic lead, in Spain, in Portugal, that's where the Roman Catholic Church is strong. The capitalist areas are becoming Protestant. The Roman Catholic Church makes a comeback in the areas that remain feudal and absolute. Okay, the next question, question 9, basically asks you to explain the Dutch Revolt, the revolt in Holland. in the 1560s. Why did it happen? Well, first of all, you need to say that Holland was traditionally the Netherlands was traditionally composed of some 17 provinces um, under the various princes and so on, but they were all inherited by Charles V, became part of his empire. And Charles became basically the ruler over this whole area. But in doing that, he recognized the privileges of the towns and of the provinces. Each of them had their own sort of freedoms or their own local privileges. And in return, the 17 provinces paid regular taxes to Charles V. This was significant because, of course, the Netherlands was becoming the richest part of Europe. Italy, from the 1520s, begins to sort of gently decline, and the Netherlands rises. Well, the revenues that Charles gets from this area are increasing, and he respects their privileges. And of course, the city of Antwerp is becoming the focal point of this new area of capitalist growth. And of course, that signifies the rise of the Atlantic. The Atlantic is against the Mediterranean. Well, all of this is threatened when Charles V retires in the mid 1550s, and you have his son, the Spanish king Philip II, becomes the ruler over the Netherlands. He wants to change everything, and in particular, he wants to basically create, after the model of Spain, a centralized bureaucracy, a centralized state, strong centralized state, which he will have control of. So he sends in Spanish bureaucrats to do this. But in addition, he's bringing in the Counter-Reformation. And in some ways, I guess, the Catholics, who were still the majority in the Netherlands, that was fine. That meant education, it meant missionizing. They were fine with that. But he wanted to bring in the uh, the the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. No, 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 no. Because the Netherlands was a cosmopolitan area, there was a coexistence, a tolerance of religious difference. Um, Even amongst the Catholics, people in the cities of the Netherlands read the works of Erasmus. The Catholics were attracted by Erasmus' teaching. And then there were the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Mennonites, even the Jews there, and they were all doing business together. So why would you want to disrupt all this? So people got upset, and it was this effort to introduce the Counter-Reformation and the centralized state, which led to the outbreak of this revolution in 1566. And we know that the South was reconquered by the Spanish army, but the North, Holland, basically became independent by 1580. And it affirmed its independence. It was able to affirm its independence. This is the conclusion, by virtue of the fact that um, its Holland was, in terms of defending itself, it was perfect for defensive warfare rather than offensive warfare because of the canals and rivers and so on. But secondly, they created a very impressive navy and merchant marine, and they began to attack the Spaniards on the high seas and in the Caribbean and so on. They were, whereas the Spaniards were trying to fight a traditional land war, the Dutch took to the sea. And finally, of course, all of this is facilitated by the fact that the revolution and war actually increases the prosperity of the Netherlands. Many of the more enterprising people from the south, they leave Antwerp and they move to Amsterdam. And um, the economy, rather than suffering from the war, actually is growing right through this period. So it's making the Netherlands stronger and stronger. So that's the answer to that question. Then the next question asks you to basically describe the development of the power of the French monarchy. Describe the development of absolutism in France. This is the last question we're going to cover today. And you begin with Charles VII back in the middle of the 15th century. Remember, Charles creates a standing army to fight against the English, to curb the nobility. Secondly, he creates a judicial system, the so-called parliaments, but especially he gets the unrestricted right to collect taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, salt taxes. They're granted unconditionally to the king. And these three things, the fiscal strength, the bureaucracy, and the standing army, enable the French kings of the latter 15th century to reconsolidate or to consolidate the power of the territorial state. The next important king is Francis I, who basically takes over control of the Catholic Church in France. He remains Catholic, but politically and administratively, the church becomes an arm of the French state under Francis. Secondly, he greatly develops the tax system, and the taxes and the fiscal bureaucracy grow dramatically under Francis I because with his standing army, he is fighting Charles V. And the last point is the royal court. Under Francis I, the French court, 8,000 people at the French court. This becomes a means of controlling the nobles and also kind of creating a kind of royal culture which strengthens the political authority of the French state. Well, all of this is very good and so on. So we have Charles VII, we have Francis I, but alas, in the 1560s, parallel to what happens in the Netherlands, religious war breaks out. And it is a religious war. It is undoubtedly, remember, Calvin was a Frenchman. Calvinism became very strong in France. It developed underground. And in the 1560s, it broke out in an attempt on the part of the Calvinists to seize power in France. And so the Catholics and the Protestants, or the Calvinists, were fighting one another. Several million people died in this war that went on from 1562 to 1598. So it was a religious war, but also the nobles had a good time fighting one another, just as they had during the Middle Ages, and at the expense of the common people. And the last point is that the towns actually joined in because they were overburdened by the French taxation system. They were rebelling against royal taxes that went on wars, which, from their perspective, were just a waste of money. So these wars went on for decades until you finally get a reconsolidation of the French state under Henry IV, which I guess was the last lecture. And there we see that he converts from being the leader of the Calvinists. He He converts to the Roman Catholic Church. Paris is worth a mass. And he puts an end to the war by issuing an Edict of Toleration in 1598, the Edict of Nantes, the Edict of Toleration. The Huguenots are recognized. They can practice their religion in France. Secondly, he begins to rebuild the French economy through mercantilist principles. And I think you know what mercantilism was all about. It's a state-directed economy, protectionism. He implements these policies in France. And finally, he's trying to conciliate the nobles. Sometimes he bribes important noblemen to keep them quiet. He initiates all kinds of conferences between the Catholics and the Protestants to try and draw them together to minimize their differences. And so on the religious front, on the economic front, on the political front, he's making progress, but he's killed. He's assassinated in 1610, and he's followed by Louis XIII and Richelieu. Richelieu is the man. He's really the prime minister. And Richelieu, you should say, is a great practitioner of raison d'etat, reason of state, Machiavellianism applied to strengthening the power of the state. And Richelieu, using the French army, he curbs the independent power of the aristocracy, but also if the Huguenots act up politically, he also brings them to heel. So he's reintroducing order, and in order to do that, he builds up the tax system. We see that as a steady theme right from Charles VII onwards, and he creates a large standing army. And he continues the policy of mercantilism. It's Richelieu who really, for example, creates the province of Quebec, the French colony of Quebec. It's under Richelieu that it really comes into being. But finally, using the army and using French money to buy the friendship of other states, he destroys the remnants of Spanish power on the continent. The Spaniards, of course, never really recovered from the defeat in the Spanish Armada against England, and their gold, their bullion was running out. But now the French army overwhelms the Spanish army, and France is now the leading power in Europe. The last king that we see this process proceeding, the last king, and the one who you might add to this discussion, was, of course, Louis XIV. And I broke off, so I'm going to sort of finish off the answer to this by simply discussing the reign of Louis XIV. Now we're going back to the lecture, but it overlaps with this last answer. So Louis has a very long reign from 1643 to 1715. And it was during his reign that France, as I said, emerged as the dominant power on the continent of Europe. England is becoming a global power, we could say. But on the continent, it is France, which is the most powerful country. In a certain sense, we can understand this in terms of the previous efforts on the part of Charles V, who aspired to rule all over Europe. Well, Louis XIV is trying the same thing. Louis XIV is all about a French attempt to basically reach dominance, hegemony over the European continent, just like Charles V did. And because he was the focal point of politics, and there are other reasons for this, he came to be called the Sun King, for obvious reasons. Now, the main sort of political instrument that he used, and here I refer to key concept, key words, is the intendant, the intendants. Royal agents were sent from Paris throughout France, and these agents were given by the king, were commissioned, and were given comprehensive powers, omnibus powers, overriding any local rights or privileges, any rights that a particular province in France had based on their medieval privileges. This was abrogated. The rights of the towns were abrogated. It was all powers given to these intendants. And so the local power of the nobles, of the provinces, of the various towns in France, basically were undermined. And using these intendants who took up residence all over France, you have a real royal centralized state with a bureaucracy that is effective at the local level. He's not kidding around. Of course, it's all financed by heavy taxation. That goes without saying. Common people suffer from this, but the royal power becomes completely effective under Louis XIV. Now, having said that, I want to make it clear that he didn't want to destroy the nobles. He just wanted to castrate them. Okay? He was a nobleman himself. The whole system was based on the hierarchy of the feudal nobility. He respected that. You can have your land. You can parade around in your fine clothes. But you can't duel anymore. You can't have a fortified fortress that might challenge royal authority at the local level. You can't sort of enlist a local clientele of followers who can challenge the authority of the central state. All of this, the local power base of the nobility is destroyed. And having done that, he turns around and says, well, he issues invitations, they're really commands, to the 20,000 leading nobles in France. And he says, of course, I respect the nobles and so on. And I have this great affection for the nobles, so I want them around me all the time. So he builds outside of Paris the great palace of Versailles, a picture of which is in your illustrations. This immense palace and garden. And he orders the nobles, the leading nobles in France, to enter what comes to be described as a gilded cage. It's a cage. He puts them in a cage in the palace, watching them and so on. And basically they're living off his expense. And it's an endless round of parties, of promenades, of banquets, and so on. But he has them under his direct control as a response, as a result. And of course, Versailles, based on this, he is this extremely powerful king, surrounded by his nobles. He creates a brilliant court, 20,000 nobles, tens of thousands of domestics and servants. And of course, a lot of culture, theater, pageants of every description. He commissions paintings. There's all kinds of new dances and music. France, under Louis XIV, emerges as the cultural leader of Europe. And people elsewhere try, that is to say, the elites, try to sort of imitate, to ape the behavior of the French nobility at the court of France. And French becomes the what we call the lingua franca of Europe. Everybody, as far away as Russia, the nobility, they all learn French because they dress in the French fashion. This is the period when France emerges as cultural leader. Culture is a political power, and of course that's true right to the present. But it's really under Louis XIV that this really becomes very distinctive in terms of France. Now, his sense of himself, he has to be described as a narcissist. At one point, he says, "L'État, c'est moi." L'État, c'est moi. That means, I am the state. I am the state. The state is me. I am the state. L'État, c'est moi. Well, in a sense, that's true because the state, the French state, did develop out of it's personalized. The king, in a certain sense, the royal authority, the centralized state, is embodied in the king. But there is an element of narcissism to this. And to cap this off, he had a bishop by the name of Bossuet write a special work, which basically confirmed the idea, it was latent prior, that he ruled by divine right. This is God's will, that France be absolute ruler over France, and also that he be the dominant power in Europe. So you have this religious confirmation of his power. Now, having said this, we note that in terms of the operation of the Catholic Church in France, the Church had already come under the control of the kings back in the day of Francis I. I explained that in 1515. But it really becomes effective under Louis XIV. The bishop, the archbishops, the abbots of the monasteries, they're completely the creatures of the French monarchy, the French king. So it's a church which is basically, it's Catholic in doctrine, but the church is controlled by the king. And indeed, Louis XIV isn't even content with that. He looks at the Protestants, and they're still there. They have no political power like the rest. The intendants have them under control. But he doesn't like the idea that somehow these people do not conform to his religion, which is Roman Catholicism. So he says, my grandfather was wrong. Henry IV was wrong. He gave the Protestants toleration in 1598. Well, in 1585, he cancels the Edict of Nantes, and he says that France is Catholic, and unless you belong to the Catholic religion, you have to leave. And almost 1 million Protestants basically flee the kingdom under Louis XIV. You can see this is a sort of the ultimate expression of his absolute power. And sort of the economic base of this is mercantilism. Well, we saw that was invented under Henry IV, continued by Louis XIII. But now it reaches its climax its acme. Under Louis XIV, he has an economics minister by the name of Colbert. And Colbert completely systemizes the economy in order to feed resources to the king to basically enjoy this absolute rule and to build up the French army and navy, which becomes the most powerful. The English don't compare. The French army rises to 500,000 men. This had never happened in the history of Europe. 500,000 troops. And the Navy is larger than the English Navy. It's 120 men of war. So the economic resources to this are given to Louis by Colbert, who organizes the economy. Now, under mercantilist principles, the state is directing all the parts of the economy, and the middle class is actually, it's getting stronger. The merchants, the bankers, they're getting stronger, but under the king, under the crown, under the economics minister, it's a state-directed economy. The middle class is sort of emerging. They grow, but they're under the state. That has to be understood. So, what is the point of all of this? The point of it is war, conquest, and basically making sure that France comes to dominate the rest of Europe. Well, while all of this is going on, France's neighbors, including the English across the Channel, are getting more and more frightened by this incredible growth of royal power. And sure enough, now he came to power as a young boy in 1643. And the early years were relatively peaceful. But starting in 1672, France, until his death, from 1672 until 1715, that's 50 years, constant war. I can only compare it to what the United States has been doing since 1990. The United States has been engaged in, since 1990, 250 conflicts, military conflicts. The Americans have been running since 1990. Anyway, this is the policy of Louis XIV. Perpetual war. And basically there were three fronts. First of all, he was going to expand the frontiers of France into Germany. Remember, Germany was weak. Germany was divided. There was a Holy Roman Emperor, but he didn't really have any power. There were just a series of small states. He extends French territory to the Rhine and beyond the Rhine. Secondly, he's dealing with the Dutch. The Dutch have all this economic power. I'm going to conquer Holland. Remember how threatened they were? They went into partnership with the English. And finally, France has, since Richelieu has conquered, has been dominant over Spain. Well, he actually sets up a scheme where he tries to put one of his cousins on the throne of Spain. He will control Spain, and through Spain, he will control the whole of Latin America. That's the plan. So he does this by war. Well, what do the other European powers, and particularly, what do the English do in the face of this? He wants dominance. He wants empire. He wants hegemony. The English answer comes to be the balance of power. The balance of power. We build up the power, the military strength of England, its navy, its army. England really gets a first-class army in this period against the threat of the French. So the army and navy are strengthened, but also the English set up a system of alliances, of with all the other states of Europe. The French are a threat. Louis XIV is a threat. In order to balance his power, we have to constitute political and military alliances. So the English respond by, of course, armament, but also these balance of power politics. And the focal point of the wars basically comes to be the contest between the English and the French. And at the end of the day, it's the English who prevail. France, the economy did develop to a certain extent under Louis XIV. But the reality is, and here we come back to England, that England was becoming an increasingly powerful capitalist state. All this time, from the beginning of the 16th century through Elizabeth and into the 17th century, English internal power is growing. The English economy, English capital is growing. And we saw that expressing itself in the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Remember I said, yes, of course, the English, in terms of their navy, first class, their ships and so on. But behind that was this rising economic and commercial power. And that continues into the 17th century. And so you have this increasingly market capitalist society, which is providing the state tax revenue to build up the English army and navy, and the English state has the revenue to buy friendships all over Europe. And the result is that France, in relative to its economic strength, is exhausted under Louis XIV. The wars drive the French economy into the ground, and the English economy gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And by the time that Louis XV dies, the French are forced to conclude a peace with the English, and this peace, it is the English who are triumphant, because the French have to surrender the Hudson's Bay territory, the Maritimes, and their dream of basically controlling the Spanish monarchy. The English get basically commercial rights, dominant commercial rights called the asiento in Latin America. Spain is simply sort of a helpless victim. The English basically come to control economically, financially, the Spanish Empire. They also are getting a predominant position in Canada. And we can say that at the end of these wars in 1715, the French are licking their wounds, and the English have emerged as a world power. Well, we'll look at the English briefly in the next class and move on to the Ottomans.
I just have one question about the final exam. So you said that the 30 questions you have at the end of the syllabus. So these are the questions, but none of them are going to.
And I've given you the answers here in the class.
Yeah. So when we write the answers to these, is there a specific number of words or pages we need to write for each question?
3 pages.
For each question?
What?
For each question?
Each question.
Hi, I just have some questions about the essay. So when I introduce my thesis, are you okay if I say something like straight out, like I will